In a sense, I got involved with the Korean Peninsula in a big way exactly because of the war in Iraq, in the sense that I could see exactly the same happening there. I hold no particular brief for the regime. It's a nasty regime. No one should suggest anything else. Nevertheless, the people who will suffer if things go wrong are going to be the ordinary North Koreans and the ordinary South Koreans as well, because you won't be able to separate the two. So I come at it from that kind of perspective. As you were told, I was a member of the European Parliament for 25 years, and I really got involved in a sense in the mid-90s. Because at that stage there was actually a famine in North Korea, and I was approached by North Korean diplomats in Paris. There were no diplomatic relations with North Korea at the time. European Commission officials were not allowed to speak to North Korean diplomats. There was only one EU embassy, which was the Swedish embassy in Pyongyang. There were no relations, so they came to see me because I worked with them a little bit. And they asked me if we could try and get some food aid. At the time, where they had the problem with CJD, mad cow disease in Europe, and they said we'll take the infected meat. Our people are starving. I mean, they're more interested in surviving the next 10 days or the next 10 weeks, not worried about what's going to happen in 10 years' time. They didn't get the infected meat, but I took a small delegation, unofficial delegation to North Korea, myself and 2 other Labour MEPs, and we saw what the situation was on the ground, came back and tabled a resolution demanding that the North Koreans allow the European Parliament to send an official delegation, and surprise, surprise, the North Koreans said yes. And so I then promptly went back on an official delegation and saw the same things, but then with rather more weight. I've now been to North Korea close to 50 times. The European Parliament set up a standing delegation with the Korean Peninsula. The socialist group sent delegations. There are a whole series of, if you want, economic workshops that I was invited to, organised by the Friedrich Neumann Foundation and the rest. And about 6-7 years ago, I was asked if I'd set up a political dialogue between Europeans and the Korean Workers' Party. And so we've had a dialogue now. We've met on about 9 or 10 occasions with the head of the international department of the party. And we go and spend 2 or 3 days there talking to him to give some idea of how important he is. He's on the Politburo. He's on the executive of the Politburo, which is 10 members, and he was in the room with the Trump, Xi and Moon summits. So we're currently organising to go back and continue that dialogue. Where are we? The North Koreans are obsessed with what happened in Iraq, what happened in Libya, and what happened in Syria. Their view is that the problem is not having weapons of mass destruction, it's not having weapons of mass destruction, because that was exactly what went wrong the first time around. I was in Pyongyang when they were being told, why don't you follow the Libyan example? Colonel Gaddafi, this is back in 2003-04, Colonel Gaddafi has given up his ambitions to become a nuclear power. He's been welcomed into the world. The same could happen to you. It was rather unfortunate that Kim Jong-un actually could watch on live TV Colonel Gaddafi being buggered with a bayonet a month before he took power, which probably explains the speeding up of the development of their nuclear deterrent. North Korea, the regime, considers it faces 2 threats. There's an external threat from the United States, a la Iraq, Libya, Syria, and there's obviously an internal threat in terms of the equivalent of the Arab Spring, the Magnolia Spring. That's the national flower of North Korea. Which is why Kim Jong-un came up with what was called the Bunjin Line. The Bunjin Line, which was endorsed by the Supreme People's Assembly and the party in 2012, actually said we need the simultaneous development of a nuclear deterrent and the economy. The nuclear deterrent was to deter the United States. The economy was to make sure that the people who matter, the 2 million people who live in Pyongyang, were actually being kept happy. The problem is there's a paradox at the heart of the Bunjin line. And the paradox is, inasmuch as you're successful in developing a nuclear deterrent, you bring down upon yourself global sanctions against the regime, so you're unable to grow the economy. Now, the reason for the nuclear deterrent is twofold. One, it's a deterrent. And we can argue about how far they've got. They have the range to crash a rocket on the mainland United States. They can set off a nuclear weapon. They probably can't marry the two together because they've never tested the two together. The rocket probably doesn't have the capacity to carry the nuclear weapon. It doesn't have a re-entry capability, and they don't really have targeting. So if they aim at Washington, they'll probably hit Baltimore, or the other way around. So there are a few little holes in the problem, but nevertheless, it's close to being a credible threat. So that's the deterrent element. The second element is because North Korea has lost the arms race. North Korea spends 25% of its budget on its military, but it's 25% of almost nothing. The South Korean economy is 45 to 50 times bigger. It spends only a couple of 2-3% on its military, but they still outspend the North Koreans by a factor of 5. South Korea spends 5 times more in its military than North Korea. If you add in Japan and the United States, North Korea is outspent by a factor of 50 times year on year. So they can no longer compete. They've been outlapped several times on that arms race. So the nuclear deterrent is also about dealing with that problem. I mean, where do you think North Korea is in the global scheme of military spending? Actually, it's just below Australia, that renowned military power. The second reason is that North Korea is not a developing country. I mean, people have the image of North Korea as if it's, in some senses, a third world country. No, it's a failed industrial state. 20, 30, 40 years ago, they stripped out the peasant from the fields into the industrial economy. There is no pool of peasant labour there to kickstart the economy, which is what Kim Jong-un actually wants to do. So that's the problem that they have to face. So the nuclear deterrent also allows them to start decanting people out of the military. Not talking about, you're talking about either cutting the conscription period from 10 years to 8, or taking 100,000 people out. It's a rather old-fashioned model of how the economy works, but it might just be successful in North Korea. It's the last pool of cheap, skilled labour probably in the world. North Koreans work for very low wages, which is why the Chinese actually are doing a lot of subcontracting work in North Korea, but they're skilled. So that's where we are. How does Kim solve his problems? Well, he clearly would prefer, frankly, to keep his nuclear deterrent. But I believe he's willing to surrender that in order to, if you want to divert resources into growing the economy, to keep the people who matter in Pyongyang happy. To do that, he needs several things. Firstly, he's willing to give up, if you want, his nuclear deterrent in exchange for security guarantees. And that's not just a piece of paper with Donald Trump's signature on the bottom, or for that matter, anybody else's. He wants real security guarantees, which will probably involve the Americans actually withdrawing their troops from South Korea. I mean, if you're serious about saying we're not going to threaten you, why would you have troops in South Korea? So, real action on the ground, that's what, apparently on one occasion somebody once said to an American, you can keep your troops there. Well, decade after decade they've been arguing they should withdraw. The Americans are in denial that they will be able to have a settlement and keep their troops in South Korea in the long term. I'm not talking about instant withdrawal. So you want serious security guarantees. Secondly, the North Koreans are actually expecting some form of compensation. I mean, they're giving up, if you want, something that's cost them billions, their nuclear deterrent, and they're looking for an infrastructure fund. The big blockage in North Korea is manpower. It is men, because it's the people in the army, which are overwhelmingly men. And secondly, energy. Because in most places in North Korea, you're lucky if you get energy for more than 2 or 3 hours a day. So they all want energy projects. So last time around, I don't know how many of you know what the agreed framework was. It was a previous deal done by Bill Clinton in 1994. And basically, the North Koreans, for a short decade, about 8-9 years, actually gave up any progress in developing nuclear weapons in exchange for the US organising the South Koreans, the Japanese and the Europeans to pay for building 2 light water reactors in North Korea. That collapsed when George Bush took over, and he got rid of, if you want, the commitment to build those light water reactors, and the whole thing started again, and we went through all the hoops. There are 2 forces driving to internationalise any settlement. On the North Korean side, I mean, the basic settlement is going to be done between Washington and Pyongyang. But on the North Korean side, because they want security guarantees, they don't trust the Americans. And I mean, they're right, and the Americans are right not to trust the North Koreans either. I'm not suggesting one is much better than the other. But they want security guarantees. And actually, rather surprisingly, they rather like the JCPOA, the Iran deal. And why did they like the Iran deal? Because in 2002, when Bush was there, and he tore up the agreed framework, it was over, finished, that's it, dead. With the Iran deal, and Trump says it's dead, and it's in trouble. That's a whole different debate. Other people said, no, the Germans, the British, the French, the United Nations, China, Russia said, hang on, the Iranians are sticking to this deal, we're going to support it. So they actually quite like the idea of some kind of multilateral guarantees. And it will probably be like it was last time around, the UN Security Council plus Germany. This time around it might be the UN Security Council plus Japan, but that's a whole different problem. So the North Koreans want to internationalise. Equally so do the Americans. Why do the Americans want to internationalise? Because Trump's victory speech is, I've done something that Obama couldn't do, nor any other president. I've made America safe again, and I've saved money. So that means somebody else is going to have to pay the $10 to $15 billion that's going to be required for the infrastructure funds. And South Korea is at the head of the list with probably 2/3. Then it's going to be possibly the Japanese, and we can get into that, the Europeans, etc. So the Americans all want to internationalise at the end, which is the same as they did with the agreed framework, and the European Parliament, with a little bit of encouragement from me, actually passed a resolution back then that's saying in future, no say, no pay. So if they want to do this, then we need to have some involvement in what the final deal is. The problem is the big fight, and I'll shut up in a minute, the big fight at the moment is not between Pyongyang and Washington, it's between Washington and Washington. Because you've got an enormous fight going on inside the US administration between, and the North Koreans are wrong on this, because Chae Sun-wi, who is the spokesman for North Korea, has been lambasting John Bolton and Mike Pompeo. Neither are particularly people I'd want to spend a long time with, but nevertheless, John Bolton's about wrecking and sabotaging the process. Pompeo is deeply sceptical, but in my view can be persuaded. The difficulty with Hanoi was that Hanoi was actually 2 summits. On day 1, Steve Bacon, who's a special representative, laid out what had been on offer when he made a speech in Stanford a week or so before. You're going to close down Yongbyon, which is the site of most of the nuclear facilities, in exchange for opening liaison offices, an end of war declaration, and some mitigation of sanctions. It was all going fine. Day 2, John Bolton comes in, waving a piece of paper, which he nails to the desk, which said, this is our definition of denuclearization. Denuclearization is giving up your nuclear weapons, your ability to make nuclear weapons material, giving up your civil nuclear program, which Kim Jong-un in his New Year's address said was going to be the core of future energy supply in North Korea, which is why in the Singapore Declaration they talked about denuclearization of the peninsula, because South Korea depends on civil nuclear power. So if you're denuclearizing the whole peninsula, you weren't giving up civil nuclear power. Also giving up their long-range missiles and their intermediate-range missiles, so they couldn't hit Japan, but Japan could hit them. Oh, giving up chemical weapons and biological weapons, and surrendering their 3,000 qualified scientists and engineers. And as it was put to me, we are not a surrendered country. We are not, even Japan in August 1945 was not asked to give up all of the equivalent of that. We are willing to negotiate away our nuclear deterrent, our ability to hit the United States with it. That's what's on offer. And I think one of the big problems is the US still does not appreciate what a loss of face that was for Kim Jong-un when he went back with nothing. Now, the people of North Korea don't know that, because they only read what's in the papers, but the leadership do. And Kim Jong-un is in a very powerful position, but he does not have an infinite room to maneuver. And certainly, in my view, those demands from John Bolton were transitional demands. The kind of demands if Kim Jong-un had met would have led to his overthrow. But of course, John Bolton's very happy about that. The only problem is we saw how successful some of those things were in Iraq, Libya and Syria. Thank you.